I never thought my uncle's funeral would be the moment my life was flipped upside down. But while everyone else was wiping away tears and whispering condolences, I heard something that cut deeper than any eulogy ever could. I heard my cousin hissing to our family's attorney, "Don't worry, he'll take the fall for the debts. His name is already on the paperwork." That's how I learned my name had been written into a trap. Not as a grieving nephew, not as a rightful heir, but as the scapegoat for debts I never created. Standing frozen in the hallway just outside the reception room, my blood went cold. This wasn't grief anymore. This was betrayal in its purest form. Before I go on, let me pause for a second. If you're into stories about betrayal, shocking twists, and the kind of revenge you don't see coming, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the rest of this. Because trust me, this one goes places you won't believe. That I pressed myself against the wall, trying to catch every word. My cousin's voice was sharp, too fast, the way people sound when they're desperate to make sure their scheme stays hidden. And the attorney? His calm, professional tone made it worse. "It's already filed. He's the executor. Once the creditors come calling, it's his mess to deal with. You and your partner will be in the clear." My heart was pounding so loud I thought they'd hear it echo through the walls. Executor? That wasn't a meaningless word. It meant responsibility. It meant I was being lined up to carry the weight of everything my uncle left behind. And by the sound of it, that wasn't inheritance. It was a mountain of debt. The sickening part was how well it all fit together. My cousin was laughing just the night before about how things always work out for her. She was the kind of person who could smile in your face while tightening a noose behind your back. And now I realized, this wasn't an accident. She'd been planning this. When I walked back into the reception area, I forced myself to act normal. She was there with a glass of wine in hand, standing far too close to a man she called her business partner. The way they kept trading glances, sharing smug little smiles, made my skin crawl. It was clear they were in this together. And for the first time, an awful thought crept into my mind. Was my uncle's death really as natural as everyone thought? I pushed that idea away quickly. That was a line I wasn't ready to cross, not yet. But the unease stayed. The next morning, I demanded a copy of the will. At first, the attorney hesitated. That pause told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't working for me. He was working for her. Still, after a moment of silence heavy enough to choke on, he handed me the file. I opened it with shaking hands. There it was, my uncle's will, neat and official, with his signature at the bottom. But the moment I looked at it, something felt wrong. I'd seen his signature 100 times, on birthday checks, on notes he left me, even on legal documents I'd once helped him file. This didn't look the same. The lines lacked the smooth confidence of his hand. It looked forced, and then I saw the attachments. Loan agreements, credit lines, even an extended mortgage I'd never heard about. Each one linked not to my uncle, but to me. In fine print, on every page, was my name. It didn't make sense. My uncle was smart with money. He never talked about debts. He never would have shoved me into a corner like this. And yet, here it was, black and white on official paper. My name, tied to debts I never signed for, never agreed to, never even knew about. I spent hours just staring at those documents, trying to breathe through the rising panic. My palms were slick, my mind racing. None of this added up unless someone had made it that way. Unless someone had gone behind the scenes, rewriting my uncle's life story on paper. Also, I would be the one left holding the bag. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying the whispers from the funeral, the smug curl of my cousin's smile, the attorney's calm assurances. It was a trap, a carefully built one, and they thought I would walk right into it. But here's the thing about me. I don't play the role of the victim. If there's one lesson life has drilled into me, it's that a trap can always be turned on the person who set it. You just need patience, timing, and the guts to play their game better than they do. They wanted me to take the fall. Instead, they'd be the ones buried under the weight of their own scheme. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. The first thing I did was take that will and spread it out on my kitchen table like I was about to dissect a crime scene. Every line, every signature, every tiny margin note stared back at me, daring me to prove it wrong. And as much as I wanted to believe it was all just a misunderstanding, the truth was staring me right in the face. The handwriting didn't belong to my uncle. I knew his signature. I'd seen it more times than I could count. On checks he'd slipped me for birthdays, on casual notes he'd left stuck to the fridge when I stayed at his place as a teenager. His pen strokes had this effortless curve to them, almost like a rhythm. But on the will in front of me, the letters looked jagged, too deliberate, like someone had copied it slowly, hoping no one would notice. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't sloppy paperwork. This was deliberate. Someone had forged my uncle's hand that I needed proof. So I dug through every old folder I had. Letters, cards, even an old receipt he'd signed once when we went to buy a secondhand grill together. I lined them up against the will and just stared. The difference was obvious. To me, it screamed fake. But to the law, to the banks, to the courts, they'd see an official stamp and a notarized page and assume it was real, that I wasn't just fighting my cousin. I was fighting the illusion of legitimacy she'd already wrapped herself in. And here's where the paranoia set in. The more I read, the more the trap unraveled. Attached to the will were not just those debts I hadn't known about, but contracts, legal language tying me into obligations I'd never signed for. It was as if someone had carefully slipped my identity into documents I had never even seen. That night, I couldn't sit still. I poured myself a drink, then another, but it didn't calm the storm. My mind kept circling back to one question. How deep did this go? If she could forge a will, what else had she been forging? The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let myself drown in speculation. I needed answers. Real ones. So I paid a visit to the bank where my uncle had kept his accounts. The banker, a man in his 50s with a stiff tie and a smile that looked stapled on, pulled up the records. He leaned closer to the screen, then frowned. Strange, he muttered. Your uncle updated his account beneficiaries just 2 weeks before he passed. 2 weeks. My stomach twisted. My uncle had been bedridden in the hospital, barely able to sign his own name, let alone shuffle through financial paperwork. I asked for a copy of the update. When it slid across the desk, my heart sank. There it was again, his supposed signature. Only now it was even clearer. Someone had rushed it. The lines uneven, the pressure of the pen too inconsistent. And next to it, a list of beneficiaries that made me clench my jaw until my teeth hurt. My cousin and a man whose name I didn't recognize that I asked the banker if he knew who the second man was. He shook his head, but I didn't need a name tag to figure it out. It was her business partner, the same smug guy who couldn't keep his hands off her at the funeral that IT was all coming together. The debts, the will, the accounts. This wasn't just my cousin trying to sneak a little extra from the inheritance. This was a full-blown scheme. And I was the fall GUI by the time I got home. Anger had replaced fear. My hands shook, not from panic this time, but from rage. They thought I was naive. They thought I'd roll over, accept the burden, and let them run off with everything that actually mattered. They didn't know me that I wasn't about to confront her yet. That would have been too easy, too predictable. Instead, I started laying out my own plan. I needed evidence, undeniable proof. Because if I was right, and I was, this wasn't just about family betrayal. This was fraud. And fraud had consequences. For now, I stayed quiet. Let her think she was winning. Let her believe I was clueless. Because the more she believed that, the deeper she'd bury herself. And when the time came, I'd be ready to dig it all up and show everyone exactly what she'd done, that I thought I'd seen enough to know what I was up against. But the deeper I dug, the uglier it got. What started as forged signatures and shady updates turned out to be just the surface of something far more calculated. That a friend of mine, Mark, works at a regional bank. He's one of those guys you can count on when you need quiet answers. I called in a favor, asked him to take a discreet look into my uncle's financial history. When he called me back the next evening, his voice had the kind of weight that made my stomach drop before he even said a word. Man, he sighed, you're not going to like this. There was a transfer. A big one. Right before your uncle passed. What kind of transfer? I asked, my throat tightening. A trust, Mark said. Your uncle's estate was moved into a trust. But here's the kicker. You're not listed as a beneficiary. You're listed as the executor, the one who handles liabilities. The actual beneficiaries? Your cousin, and some guy named Andrew Fletcher. Andrew Fletcher. The name hit me like a punch. I didn't need to think twice. I knew exactly who that was. Her so-called business partner. I thanked Mark and hung up, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. A trust. Not just forged documents. Not just a fake signature. They had restructured everything. funneling the assets into a setup that locked me into the debts while clearing the path for them to scoop up the money. And here's the part that burned the most. My uncle couldn't have done it. He physically couldn't. 2 weeks before he died, he was hooked up to machines, barely able to hold a pen. There was no way he could have gone to a notary. No way he could have signed trust documents with steady hands. Which meant only one thing: someone did it for him. Someone made it look like his decision. And that someone was sitting across from me at the funeral, sipping wine and smirking that I wasn't just angry anymore. I was terrified. Because fraud this big doesn't happen without help. Lawyers, maybe even notaries, had to be in on it. This wasn't just my cousin playing dirty. This was a network. And if I tried to confront her without proof, they'd bury me faster than my uncle. So I started playing my own game. I went back through the will, the loan agreements, the account updates, and now, this trust. Every time I spotted my uncle's signature, I snapped a high-resolution photo. I created a folder on my laptop labeled Vacation 2019, a disguise, so if anyone snooped, they'd think it was just family photos. Inside, I built a timeline of every suspicious move they had made, but gathering evidence wasn't enough. I needed eyes on them. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her point one evening. After pretending to be too busy to attend a family dinner, I parked down the street from her townhouse. Hours passed. Finally, I saw her and Fletcher slip out the door, dressed sharp, like they were headed for something more formal than a casual night out. I trailed them, careful to keep my distance. They drove across town to a sleek office building, the kind with mirrored windows that make you feel like you're being watched. They went inside. 10 minutes later, the lights flicked on in a conference room on the second floor. From where I sat, I could see just enough through the glass to make out folders, papers, signatures. They weren't out for dinner. They were meeting with someone that I couldn't get close enough to hear, but I didn't need the words. I knew the body language. The leaning in, the pointing at papers, the way my cousin's hand trembled slightly when she signed something. It all screamed deal. I sat there in the dark, watching the shadows of betrayal play out against the glass. And I realized this was no longer about inheritance. This was a conspiracy, and they were bold enough to keep signing papers, confident no one would ever catch them. But they were wrong to be. By the time I drove away that night, the fear had faded. What I felt now was resolve. They wanted me to drown under fake debts and walk away with the fortune? Fine. I'd let them keep digging. Let them get comfortable. Because the deeper they buried themselves, the easier it would be to expose them when the time came. They thought I was their pawn. But I was about to flip the board. When you realize people are plotting to destroy you, you get two choices: confront them head-on and risk getting crushed, or play it smart and let them think they're winning. I chose the latter. The night after trailing my cousin and Fletcher, I sat at my desk, scrolling through the photos I'd taken of the forged signatures. The more I looked at them, the more my anger sharpened into something colder. This wasn't just family betrayal anymore. It was fraud, and fraud left fingerprints. I just had to collect them. The first step was getting an expert. I remembered an old neighbor of mine, a retired police officer who'd gone into private consulting. He specialized in handwriting analysis. I gave him a call, careful with my words. No details, just that I needed a professional comparison done. When we met the next day at a diner off the highway, I slid the photos across the booth. He studied them, adjusting his glasses, taking his time. After a long silence, he leaned back. "Whoever did this," he said, "wasn't bad. But it's not the same hand. Your uncle's real signature has natural flow. They're traced. I'd stake my reputation on it." Hearing it out loud was both a relief and a gut punch. I finally had proof that I wasn't crazy. But proof in a booth over black coffee wasn't going to take them down. I needed more. That's when I decided to plant my own listening ears. My cousin had recently hired contractors to install a new security system in the family office where the attorney kept our uncle's records. Lucky for me, one of those contractors owed me a favor. With a few carefully chosen words and a promise of cash under the table, I convinced him to let me inspect the system before it went live that I wasn't there to inspect. I slipped a tiny voice recorder behind the bookshelf, angled just right to catch conversations at the main desk. Then I walked out like nothing had happened. 2 days later, the recorder gave me my first real win. I sat in my car late at night, headphones plugged in, listening to the tinny playback. There it was, her voice. Sharp, impatient. "He doesn't suspect a thing. The debts will bury him before he even knows what hit him. Fletcher laughed in the background, his voice dripping with arrogance. By the time he figures it out, we'll be long gone. The trust pays out in 60 days. I rewound it 3 times, my hands shaking as I listened. There it was. The scheme laid bare in their own words. They weren't just greedy. They were confident. So confident they were practically bragging that I wanted to storm over there, shove the recorder in their faces, and watch their smug smiles vanish. But I forced myself to breathe. It wasn't enough. A single recording wouldn't hold up in court. I needed more documents, witnesses, a trail they couldn't deny. That night, I added the audio file to my secret folder, tucked safely under the fake vacation photos. Then I sat back and thought, if they were this bold in private, they'd slip again. People like that always do. The next morning, I started digging deeper. I called a contact at the county records office and asked about recent property filings under my uncle's name. What I found made my blood run cold. Just days before his death, a deed transfer had been filed, moving one of his rental properties into the trust. Again, signed with the same shaky, fake signature. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Forged will, fake bank updates, property transfers, and now, their own words on tape. But if I'd learned anything so far, it was this. Exposing them wasn't just about proving fraud. It was about timing. If I moved too soon, they'd wriggle out of it. I needed them to hang themselves with their own rope. So I kept collecting, kept listening, kept pretending to play the role of the clueless nephew drowning in paperwork. All the while, I was setting the stage, because when the curtain finally rose, I wanted the whole world to see exactly who they really were. The more evidence I collected, the more I knew one thing for certain. My cousin wasn't stupid. She was greedy, reckless, and overconfident, but not stupid. And sooner or later, she was going to notice that I wasn't acting like the fool she thought I was. That moment came faster than I expected. One evening, I got a letter slipped under my apartment door. No envelope, no stamp. Someone had hand-delivered it. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. Inside was a single page, typed in sharp, formal language. Cease all inquiries into the estate, or legal action will follow. At the bottom was her signature, bold and shaky, like she'd scrawled it in a rush. For a moment, I laughed. The letter was meant to scare me, but all it did was confirm exactly what I needed. It was her. She'd put herself on paper, threatening me directly. And in her arrogance, she'd used the same pen style, the same jagged strokes I'd already seen on the forged documents. I tucked the letter into a folder with the others. It wasn't just intimidation, it was evidence. But she didn't stop there. The next day, she called me. Her voice was sugar-sweet at first, fake concern dripping from every word. I heard you've been asking questions, she said. That's not healthy, you know. Uncle wouldn't want you stressing yourself over paperwork. I played dumb. What do you mean? Oh, come on, she snapped, dropping the mask. Don't pretend you don't know. You're digging where you don't belong. If you're not careful, you're going to find yourself in a very bad position. Her words hung heavy in the silence. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Not the kind you read in books, but the quiet, real kind people use when they think they've got all the power. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to sound clueless. I just want to understand what's going on, I said softly. That's all. She let out a sharp laugh. Then understand this, you're broke. You're the one left holding the debts. That's what Uncle wanted. Accept it and move on. It was almost too perfect. She was so desperate to keep me in line that she'd admitted the whole setup in her own words. I wanted to slam the phone down and race to the police right then and there, but I knew better. This wasn't enough. Not yet. Instead, I calmly ended the call, sat down at my desk, and wrote everything out. Every word she'd said, every threat, every slip. I printed the phone log to prove the call happened and stapled it to the handwritten summary. Then I slid it into my growing evidence binder. Later that week, I ran into her business partner outside the courthouse. He didn't notice me at first, but when he finally did, his smirk was as smug as ever. Better get your checkbook ready, he said under his breath as he brushed past me. That was their problem. They thought intimidation worked. They thought fear was enough to silence me. But every letter, every call, every cocky comment wasn't scaring me. It was giving me ammunition. The mistake my cousin made was believing she could control the narrative. She didn't realize I was documenting everything. stacking proof on top of proof until it was heavy enough to crush her entire scheme. When I got home that night, I laid out the letter, the phone log, and my notes next to the forged will and the property transfers. The pile was growing, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't since this all started. Confidence. She thought she was cornering me, but all she was really doing was painting herself into a corner of her own making. And when the time came to turn it all around, her favorite mistake would be the nail in her coffin. The intimidation only made me more certain of what I had to do. My cousin thought she had all the control, but control is just an illusion. All it takes is the right push, and the illusion cracks. That was exactly what I planned to do. Crack her wide open. I needed her to make a mistake big enough that no amount of smooth talking could erase it. I had her voice on tape, her threats in writing, and her forged documents, but none of it was enough to corner her legally. Not yet. She had to walk herself into a trap, something undeniable. I built one. I spent weeks crafting a story. One designed to spread like wildfire through the exact person I knew couldn't keep his mouth shut. Her partner, Fletcher. If you wanted gossip to reach my cousin, you didn't have to tell her directly. You just had to tell him, and his arrogance would do the rest. One night, I ran into him at a bar downtown. He was already a few drinks in, bragging to anyone who would listen about his business ventures. I slid onto the stool next to him, ordered a whiskey, and waited for him to notice me. Well, he grinned, slurring just slightly. The family screw up. How's it feel being buried under uncle's debts? I forced a smile, playing the part of the beaten-down nephew. Not great, I said, letting my voice crack just enough. But, things might not be as locked down as you think. That got his attention. He leaned closer. What's that supposed to mean? I lowered my voice, like I was letting him in on a secret. Let's just say a friend found something. Another version of the will. One where the debts aren't on me. One where the assets are a little more balanced. He froze for just a second, then smirked like he was in on the game. You're bluffing. I shrugged, tossing back my drink. Maybe, or maybe not. Guess you'll find out soon enough. Then I left that I didn't need him to believe me fully. I just needed him to believe it enough to panic and to run back to her. Sure enough, within days, the whispers started. My cousin called me out of the blue, her tone sharp and frantic. What's this I hear about another will? I played dumb, pretending not to know what she was talking about. That only made her angrier. Don't play games with me, she hissed. If there's another document, I'll find it. And when I do, you're finished. I let her rage. The more rattled she was, the better. Behind the scenes, I tightened the net. I reached out to the district attorney's office, explained the situation, and handed over the recordings and documents I had so far. They didn't dismiss me like I'd feared. In fact, they leaned in. Keep collecting, the investigator told me. If they move to alter or destroy evidence, that's when we'll step in. Perfect. That was exactly what I was counting on. A week later, I heard what I'd been waiting for. Fletcher had bragged to someone at a poker game that they were meeting with a notary to fix a few things. He couldn't resist showing off. He'd taken the bait. The pieces were falling into place. I had them nervous, desperate, and about to make the very mistake that would seal their fate. And I was ready to be there when it happened. The moment I heard Fletcher had spilled about meeting a notary, I knew the clock was ticking. They weren't going to sit still and let their scheme collapse. They were going to scramble, patch the holes, and cover their tracks. And that was exactly the move I needed them to make. I met with the investigator from the district attorney's office in a cramped conference room that smelled faintly of old coffee and paper. He was a no-nonsense guy, gray suit, tired eyes, but sharp. I laid out the documents one by one, the forged will, the property transfers, the bank updates, and the letter my cousin had slipped under my door. When I played the recording of her voice, the part where she bragged I'd never know what hit me, he didn't even blink. He just leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This is good, he said quietly. But we need them on the hook for more. Something recent. Something active. I nodded. They're planning to meet a notary. To fix things. That got his attention. He sat forward, eyes narrowing. Perfect. If they try to alter legal documents, we'll have grounds for fraud, forgery, conspiracy. We can stage it, record everything. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of hope. Not relief, not yet, but hope that we put the plan in motion quickly. A cooperating notary, someone who had worked with the DA before, agreed to be part of the setup. The meeting would go ahead as planned, but the room would be wired for audio and video. Every word, every forged signature, every nervous laugh would be captured. My job was simple: stay quiet. Don't spook them. Don't let them know the walls were closing in. That was easier said than done. 2 nights before the meeting, my cousin showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked polished as ever, hair perfect, smile wide. But her eyes gave her away. They darted around the room, restless, calculating. "I came to clear the air," she said, settling onto my couch like she owned the place. "We've had our misunderstandings. But you should know, this isn't personal. Uncle trusted me. He wanted me to handle things. You don't need to make this harder than it has to be." Her tone was smooth, rehearsed, but there was an edge underneath it. She wasn't here to clear the air. She was here to test me, to see if I knew more than I was letting on. I forced a tired smile. "I don't want any trouble. I just want what's fair." She studied me, searching my face for cracks. Then, almost casually, she said, "Good. Because if this gets messy, it won't end well for you. Better to walk away while you can." There it was, the threat behind the charm. I kept my face blank, my voice steady. "I'll think about it." She left soon after, heels clicking against the hallway floor like gunshots. The moment the door shut, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. She was nervous, rattled, and that was exactly what I wanted. The next day, I met again with the investigator. "She came to me last night," I told him. "Tried to scare me off." He scribbled notes, nodding slowly. "That's good. It means she's feeling the pressure. Let her. The more desperate she gets, the sloppier she'll be at the meeting." We finalized the details: the notary's office, the timing, the recording setup. Everything was ready. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance anymore. I was fighting for my name, my future, my freedom. If they pulled this off, I'd be buried under debts that weren't mine, my life ruined. But if the plan worked, if everything went the way it was supposed to, they'd be the ones exposed. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to their moves. I was 2 steps ahead. And in less than 48 hours, the trap would spring shut. The day of the meeting, I woke up with my stomach in knots. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation, the kind that makes every second feel heavier than it should. For weeks, I'd been gathering evidence, stacking proof, waiting for them to slip. And now, finally, the stage was set. The notary's office was small, tucked on the second floor of a brick building downtown. To anyone passing by, it looked ordinary: beige walls, fluorescent lights, a waiting area with old magazines scattered across a coffee table. But I knew better. Hidden in the corners were microphones, tiny cameras, every angle covered. I wasn't allowed to be in the room. The DA's team made that clear. "If you show your face, it spooks them," the investigator warned. "We need them calm, thinking they're safe." So I sat across the street in an unmarked sedan, headphones over my ears, listening to the feed in real time. Every tick of the second hand on my watch echoed louder than the last. At exactly 2 p.m., they arrived. My cousin, dressed sharp as ever, heels clicking against the tile. Fletcher followed, his suit a size too flashy, his smirk plastered on like he was walking into a victory lap. Through the hidden mic, I heard the notary greet them. Calm, professional, polite. Papers shuffled. Chairs scraped. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice," my cousin began, her voice steady but carrying a nervous edge. "We just need a few small adjustments. A clarification of the will. Nothing major." My jaw clenched as I listened. Nothing major? They were about to commit fraud in broad daylight, right in front of a notary. Fletcher jumped in, his arrogance dripping through the speakers. "We just want to make sure everything reflects Uncle's wishes. Clean, efficient, no loose ends." The notary played it perfectly, pretending to skim the documents with casual interest. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Why don't you walk me through what needs changing?" That was when my cousin pulled out the forged will. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as she slid it across the desk. "There," she said quickly. "The debts. They should remain under him, under my cousin. But we'd like the distribution of assets to reflect a joint beneficiary structure. Myself and Andrew Fletcher." Hearing my name tied to debts in her voice made my blood boil. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The notary leaned in. "And you're sure this reflects his true wishes?" "Absolutely," she said without hesitation. "Uncle wanted me to take care of things. He trusted me." There was a pause, just long enough to stretch my nerves thin. Then the sound of a pen clicking echoed through the feed. Fletcher chuckled. Let's get it done. That was the moment I knew we had them. Every word, every forged adjustment, every smug laugh. It was all being captured in crystal clarity. And they had no idea. The meeting dragged on for nearly an hour. They signed, initialed, laughed, even joked about how easy this stuff is when you know the right people. I could almost see their grins from across the street. But to me, it was like watching them dig their own graves. With every stroke of the pen, they buried themselves deeper. When the meeting finally ended, they strutted out of the building like they owned the world. My cousin's smile was wide, her head held high. Fletcher lit a cigarette on the curb, exhaling like he'd just pulled off the heist of the century. That I stayed perfectly still in my car, heart pounding, watching them walk away. They thought they'd won. They thought they were untouchable. But little did they know, the very walls of that office had been their undoing. And in just a few days, when the evidence was unveiled in front of the entire family and the court, they'd finally learn what it felt like to lose everything. The family gathered in the courthouse conference room on a gray Monday morning. The air was heavy, the kind of heavy that comes when money and bloodlines collide. My cousin sat at the front with Fletcher by her side, her smile wide, her posture perfect. She looked like a queen waiting for her crown. I sat quietly across the table, hands folded, my binder resting at my feet. I could feel her eyes on me, smug and certain. She thought today was the day she walked out rich and I walked out ruined. The attorney began, clearing his throat as he opened the will. His voice droned through the formalities, reading each line with clinical precision. My cousin leaned back in her chair, lips curving in satisfaction every time the word executor, my name, passed his mouth. And then came the moment. The estate is to be distributed, the attorney read, with debts assigned to the executor. Assets to be split between. He paused, his eyes flicking over the page. Ms. Rebecca Collins and Mr. Andrew Fletcher. I heard the faint scrape of a chair as she shifted, basking in the room's attention. Fletcher smirked, tapping his pen against the table like a drumbeat of victory. That's when I stood. Before we go any further, I said, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through the monotony. I need to submit evidence. The attorney frowned. Mr. Collins, this isn't. It is relevant. I cut him off. Because what you're reading isn't my uncle's will. It's a forgery. The room erupted in murmurs. My cousin's smile faltered for just a second before she caught herself. That's absurd, she snapped. You're just bitter. I lifted the binder onto the table and flipped it open. Here are samples of my uncle's real signature, I said, sliding them forward. And here, I pulled out the forged will, the bank updates, the property transfers, is the so-called paperwork you've been waving around. Compared side by a handwriting expert. They don't match. Gasps echoed through the room. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but I wasn't done. I reached into the folder again. And this, I pressed play on a recorder, is what my cousin said about me. In her own words. Her voice filled the room, tinny but clear. He doesn't suspect a thing. The debts will bury him before he even knows what hit him. Fletcher's laugh followed, just as damning. The murmurs turned into a storm. Family members turned to stare, some with shock, some with anger. My cousin's face drained of color. You manipulated Uncle's estate, I said, my voice sharp now. You forged documents, transferred property, and tried to bury me under debts that weren't mine. She tried to speak, but her words caught in her throat. Fletcher leaned in, whispering furiously, his smug mask slipping. That's when the door opened. 2 investigators from the DA's office stepped inside, their presence heavy enough to silence the entire room. Rebecca Collins. Andrew Fletcher. You need to come with us. The room froze. My cousin's eyes went wide, her hands trembling as she scrambled for an explanation. Fletcher stood abruptly, but the investigator's hand on his shoulder kept him down. No, this isn't. This is a misunderstanding. My cousin cried, her voice cracking, but it was too late. Every piece of evidence, every signature, every recording had already been handed over. The meeting at the notary, their signatures on video, it was all locked and I sat back in my chair, watching as the illusion of control slipped from her hands. For the first time, her smile was gone. Fletcher's arrogance vanished too, replaced with the pale look of a man who finally realized he wasn't untouchable as they were escorted out. The room was silent except for the sound of papers rustling. My uncle's legacy had nearly been twisted into their victory, but instead, their own greed had dragged them into ruin. And me? For the first time since this nightmare began, I could finally breathe. In the weeks that followed, everything unraveled for Rebecca and Fletcher. The investigation moved quickly once the evidence was laid bare. The forged signatures, the altered trust documents, the audio recordings, and, most damning of all, the notary meeting caught on video. There was no room left for denial, no angle for them to escape through. The court declared the will invalid. Every shady transfer, every falsified signature was struck down. My uncle's estate was restored to its rightful form, and I was cleared of every debt they had tried to bury me under. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of lies pressing down on my chest. Why cousin avoided eye contact in court. Gone was the polished confidence, the smile that had once dripped with superiority. Fletcher looked even worse, hollow, exhausted, like he couldn't believe the world had finally caught up with him. The same arrogance that once fueled them had become their downfall, but the story wasn't about their ruin. It was about my survival. With my name cleared, I had decisions to make. Part of my uncle's estate was still rightfully mine, and for a moment I thought about selling everything, walking away, and never looking back. But then I remembered the lessons of the past months. I remembered how quickly life could be twisted by greed, how fragile reputations could be, how important it was to take control of your own story. I didn't walk away. I invested. I took the money they had tried to steal and poured it into something real, my own business, my own future. Every day that I walked into that office, every decision I made, carried the weight of what I'd survived. And in a strange way, I was grateful. Not to them, not for their betrayal, but for what it taught me. I learned patience. I learned strategy. I learned that revenge isn't about rage, it's about justice. And justice, when it finally lands, is sweeter than anything else. That I still think back to that day at the funeral, hearing my name whispered in the shadows. At the time, it felt like the beginning of the end. But now, I see it differently. It wasn't the end. It was the spark. The moment that forced me to stand up, fight back, and take control of my life in a way I never had before. Rebecca and Fletcher thought they were burying me. Instead, they dug their own grave, and I walked away freed. Now I'll ask you, the ones who've stuck with me through this entire story, did I do the right thing? If you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet and let it slide, or would you have fought back the way I did? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice, make sure you hit subscribe, drop a like, and join me next time. Because trust me, I've got plenty more stories you won't want to miss.